about to go on a journey of the Mi'kmaq people's history, including that of my own family in Newfoundland. You will see how these people lost their culture and resources to Canada and how they are still largely unrecognized. In fact, the very process that was set up to offer recognition was badly managed, re-inflicting pain upon Mi'kmaq families who are already living with intergenerational trauma. This is an awakening.
I now invite the Mi'kmaq Epic Gig drummers to share the Mi'kmaq honor song.
I will be reading a summary of the history of the Mi'kmaq people in Canada extracted from the following three sources. First, the history of the Newfoundland Mi'kmaq from the Heritage Newfoundland and Labrador website, written by Ralph T. Pasteur in 1998. Second, the website of the Koski-Minsky law firm. And third, an article in the Star titled, "In Newfoundland, Too Many Want Recognition as Mi'kmaq Indians, Federal Government Says," by Sandro Contenta, 2013. Some of this history is directly quoted from the sources listed.
And I will be interjecting snippets of my family's history as we move along the timeline. In addition to my voice, you will hear clips from discussions with my cousin, Grandma Salmon, Sylvia Murphy of Newfoundland, my uncle, William Locke of Ontario, and my uncle Tony Locke, previously of Newfoundland, who now resides in Alberta. There are also audio clips with their sources included. And finally, the music for this podcast is from the concluding ceremony of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. Among the musicians on stage are my cousin Grandma Salmon, Sylvia Murphy, and her daughter, Margaret Jessica Cranford.
The Mi'kmaq people have occupied Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as parts of Nova Scotia, PEI, and New Brunswick for over 10,000 years. Newfoundland Mi'kmaq range throughout the interior of the island, traveling great distances throughout the year. Although families laid claim to specific trapping territories, hunting for meat, especially caribou, was open to all. The Mi'kmaq way of life was greatly impacted by the completion of a railway across the island in 1898. For the first time, it was possible for large numbers of settlers and sportsmen to have quick access to the interior caribou herds. By all accounts, the slaughter was appalling. It is estimated that the herds fell from 2 to 300,000 in 1900 to near extinction by 1930. The effect on the Mi'kmaq was catastrophic. Caribou meat had always been a mainstay of the Mi'kmaq diet. As a result, the 20th century brought new challenges and hardships for the island's native people. By the beginning of this century, where once only Mi'kmaq had traveled, now there were settlers hunting, trapping, and fishing for salmon, and sportsmen taking an increasing toll of the declining caribou herds. In 1905, the Newfoundland government gave the Anglo-Newfoundland Development Corporation a huge amount of land in the interior and a site on the Exploits River, Grand Falls, where the company built a large modern mill. Logging crews accelerated the destruction of the caribou by killing them for meat.
In 1911, my great-grandmother, Christina Beatrice Duhart, was born. She was full Mi'kmaq and baptized Roman Catholic. She was born to Joseph and Maud Duhart, who lived in Humbermouth on the west coast of Newfoundland.
A downward spiral of fur prices in the 1920s and the depression of the 1930s was also destructive to the Mi'kmaq way of life. Although some Mi'kmaq were able to find work as loggers in the 1930s, the period was one of real hardship for most.
By 1921, at the age of 10, she was forced, not by the government but by poverty, to leave her home to work as a servant for the Locke household of English Welsh descent. According to my grandfather, her son, and other relatives, Christina was treated very badly by the lady of the house and was forced to work long hours. There were no residential schools in Newfoundland at the time, though I would like to draw a parallel between a residential school experience and that of working as a servant at the age of 10 for an English household. Both removed the child from their family and culture, potentially exposing them to abuse. By 1930, at the age of 19, Christina married Andrew, a son from the Locke household where she worked, and had her first child, William Locke, my grandfather. He was the first of 17 children that my grandmother gave birth to and raised in Corner Brook, Newfoundland. 17 children. My grandfather would be forced to drop out of school halfway through grade 7 to work to help support his family. At his first job, working as a janitor, my 12-year-old grandfather suffered severe racism and mistreatment.
Older Mi'kmaq today from the West Coast recount how their neighbors stigmatized them as jacketars and how some people hid their native ancestry for fear of ridicule.
But we grew up, there were no native people in Newfoundland there, right? Nobody admitted that they were native.
Newfoundland's Mi'kmaq received no federal benefits because when Newfoundland joined Canada in 1949, the Mi'kmaq were not recognized as status Indians. In the case of the Mi'kmaq, then Premier Joey Smallwood told the federal government that there were no Indians on the island of Newfoundland, says Adrian Tanner, a Memorial University anthropologist. This could have been deliberate. Smallwood might not have wanted to bother with a group who might interfere with his development plans, or it might have been Smallwood's ignorance, which is hard to believe as he had an encyclopedic mania for Newfoundland facts. But on the West Coast, many of the Mi'kmaq anglicized their names, hid their identity, and tried to avoid being called racist slurs such as jacketar. However, at the time of Confederation, it would not have taken much effort for Smallwood to have found some Mi'kmaq population.
In 1949, my mother Florence was born, and in 1951, my grandfather William Locke and his wife, Megan Locke, left Newfoundland to look for work in Ontario. My grandparents didn't know how long it would take to find work in Ontario or where they would be living, so it was safer to leave my mom with Christina until they were settled. Christina agreed to care for my mother until my grandparents were settled, even though she was pregnant and gave birth to her daughter Sandra later that year. My grandfather was able to find work as a janitor, and my grandparents qualified for government housing in Toronto, close to Yorkdale Shopping Mall. Any extra money they had was sent home to Newfoundland to help care for my mother, who lived with Christina until she was approximately 11 years old before moving to Ontario. The following statement was written by my great-aunt Sandra Locke of her memories from the late 1950s and 60s, and read by my daughter Amanda.
One of the most awesome memories I have to share from when I was a child is how my mom's Mi'kmaq family and friends from Bedak, Cape Breton would come to visit her. They would bring their homemade baskets to sell to make money to help them survive. When they came, Mom sent some of her children with them to help sell the baskets. I always went with them, proud as a peacock. I knew they had a much better chance of selling their baskets when one of us went with them. Mom fed them and let them stay at our house. I remember the long rectangular porch entrance we had. They would all sit on the floor with their backs to the wall and spend a night or two. They never stayed long. They had a lot of baskets to sell and many, many miles to walk. Their journey was by foot and ferry. They traveled in large numbers for safety. I never knew or understood why I felt so comfortable with them and why I was so interested in everything about them. I never knew I was Mi'kmaq.
The Mi'kmaq used to come to Grandma's house, and they used to have their baskets. Most of these women came from Nova Scotia, and Grandmother would let them sleep in the hallway. And the girls used to go down in the valley with them, down Broadway and everything, to sell their baskets with them.
And it was women that would come with the baskets?
Yes.
Oh, I wasn't sure if it was men or women or both. Okay,
Well, the men came along too, but see, you got to realize too that most everything was done secretly, because you didn't do things openly.
In the 1960s and 1970s, Newfoundland Mi'kmaq were part of a general movement by Aboriginal people throughout North America to reclaim their rights as First Nations. In Conne River, flooding resulting from a hydroelectric project and construction of new roads to the south further depleted caribou hunting and fur trapping in the region. Partly in response to these factors, the people of Conne River elected a chief and band council in 1972. A year later, Mi'kmaq from the entire province came together in an organization called the Federation of Newfoundland Indians, the purpose of which was to achieve recognition by the federal government.
Her cousin, Hubert Duhart, was chief.
Oh,
Okay.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
In the 70s, you mean? Or when?
Yeah, in Corner Brook, yeah. But 1987 is when I started to try to get my status. 1987.
In 1989, the Federation of Newfoundland Indians launched a federal court case seeking recognition under the Indian Act. The federal government then agreed to talks and a deal was ratified in 2008. Prime Minister Stephen Harper flew to Newfoundland to announce and praise the agreement. The Qalipu Mi'kmaq Band was formed pursuant to the agreement for the recognition of the Qalipu Mi'kmaq Band dated June 23, 2008. The application process commenced in 2008. It recognizes the Mi'kmaq as a band with no land or reserve. People applying to be registered as Indians under the federal law do not have to meet a blood quantum, used by governments in the past to determine the degree of ancestry. They have to prove that they are of Canadian Indian ancestry. They also have to prove they were members of the Mi'kmaq community before 1949 or descendants of someone who was.
My grandfather, William Locke, and many of his brothers and sisters, such as my Uncle Tony, my Aunt Gloria, and their children, like my cousin Sylvia, who is the daughter of Clarence Locke, submitted their applications, and many of their applications were approved.
I got my letter stating I'm a Canadian Indian.
Right.
Okay, I got that framed and everything.
So they approved you, and then they retroactively said, on second thought, we're changing the criteria.
Here with details on the division discussion is APTN's Justin Brake. After watching members of her community denied Indian status and membership under Qalipu Mi'kmaq First Nation, Flat Bay Chief Liz Lasaiga says she has no choice but to look at separating from the band. In a statement on Facebook, Lasaiga said, "The Qalipu enrollment process is seriously unprofessional and the membership illegitimate. When more than 100,000 people applied to join Qalipu, Canada re-evaluated applications under more stringent rules. Roughly 80,000 were rejected. Lasaiga says it was a flawed enrollment process." Justin Brake, APTN National News, Halifax.
Tell us about our ancestors that had nothing.
Qalipu Mi'kmaq in Newfoundland is the country's newest First Nation, having been officially established 7 years ago, and controversy is raging over who can be a member of the landless band. More than 100,000 people applied, but the vast majority have been rejected in a clash between bureaucratic process and cultural identity.
The Qalipu First Nation will do what we can to try to talk some sense into the government of Canada.
It's a process that has divided families, literally.
Mine was approved. My oldest, who was 8, he was approved, and my youngest, who was 6, was denied.
Chris O'Neill Yates looks at the fight for status.
Mi'kmaq elder Calvin White illustrates how the struggle to get status for Newfoundland Mi'kmaq has gone wrong. 3 of his children are considered Indigenous, and 3 are not.
They grew up here in Flat Bay, they were educated here in Flat Bay, but for employment opportunities they had to move elsewhere.
The Qalipu First Nation was created in 2011. Some 26,000 members are scattered across Newfoundland. But when the process of getting recognition from Ottawa began in 2008, more than 100,000 people applied for status. That's 20% of the entire population of Newfoundland. To deal with all of these applicants, the Qalipu First Nation and Ottawa revamped the process. Proof of residency and connection to the community became part of a new, complicated set of criteria.
How many times did you phone home? How many times did you travel to Newfoundland? How many times you went berry picking? Do you live an Aboriginal way of life? All of these things is what came into play, which has absolutely nothing to do with whatsoever of who you are.
White says this agreement failed many Mi'kmaq. He believes lineage should have been the basis for recognition.
There is a paper trail. And that should have been used, it should have been needed. I don't think any of our people would have been left out.
The discontent of thousands of Qalipu Mi'kmaq is directed at Brendan Mitchell, their chief.
I'm not going to sit here and tell you 103,000 people should be in this band.
This was a younger picture of Matty Mitchell.
Most Newfoundlanders would have learned about his legendary great-grandfather, Matty Mitchell, in their history books. But bloodline isn't all Mitchell inherited.
Strife, families upset, families are broken, communities upset, tremendous amount of hurt. We have a case where twins in the same household, one is in and one is out. These are things that we're trying to find reasons or answers to.
Mitchell, too, disagrees with the new criteria, such as proof of practicing a Mi'kmaq way of life.
They may be practicing their culture every day, but they haven't got a picture of themselves, a selfie, saying, "Look at me, I'm smudging," or "Look at me, I'm passing the pipe." You know, I just went to a powwow. Look at me.
A reality that threatens the very movement that White and others started all those decades ago. Chris O'Neill Yates, CBC News, Flat Bay, Newfoundland.
Conservative MP Greg Rickford, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, made clear during a March 28th debate that the government smells something fishy. It is simply not reasonable to expect that there would be more than 100,000 credible applications to be members of the Qalipu Mi'kmaq Band, Rickford told the House of Commons. That would be over 4 times the original estimated number. These figures are all the more questionable since it has become clear that many of the late-stage applications appear to no longer reside in the province. Angela Robinson, a Memorial University anthropologist who has extensively researched the Mi'kmaq, explained that in Newfoundland there have been generations of prejudice, marginalization, and intermarriage. Hiding Indian ancestry was so common that whole family histories were buried and forgotten. The terms of inclusion in this band were quite broad. Given the extent of intermarriage and the large size of Newfoundland families, few should be surprised at the numbers that applied for recognition. The majority of people outside of St. John's do have Aboriginal ancestry.
My grandfather had to work through strong emotions as he wrote his application. After living through heinous racism to the point where it was unsafe to be Indigenous, not receiving higher education because he had to work at the age of 12, and having to leave Newfoundland in 1951 because he couldn't find employment that would pay a living wage, he was finally given an opportunity for compensation. Based on the 2013 retroactive criteria, his application was rejected. The 2013 agreement placed a heavy onus on Mi'kmaq that had left the province of Newfoundland to have visited Newfoundland frequently. Do you know how much it costs to fly to Newfoundland from Ontario? It has always been very expensive to fly there due to limited demand. It takes at least 2 to 3 days to drive to Newfoundland from Ontario, plus a ferry ride. My grandparents lived in government-assisted housing. Making a phone call to Newfoundland was a limited event because the cost of long distance was so high. We take Canada-wide calling for granted now, but it used to be very expensive. The 2013 assessment criteria is completely unrealistic for applicants that left Newfoundland to escape poverty.
I applied and I got it, yeah, and they took away all the benefits 5 or 6 years ago.
Everything to any government comes down to dollars and cents in the final analysis. And it was just too much money. Like I said, people were applying like crazy and they just didn't want to do it. It was just too much and as far as they were concerned. And like I said, they even took away status from people who had it. So
when the government and the NFI applied administrative rationalism by looking at census records to try to understand how many Indigenous people still existed in Newfoundland, they couldn't account for the toxic shame and prejudice, and they also couldn't account for how much love and pride there was that still existed in these families for their Indigenous heritage.
The late Mr. Jerry Brake, with the help of the law firm Koski Minsky, has initiated a class proceeding against the Attorney General of Canada on behalf of all individuals whose applications for Qalipu Band membership were rejected in accordance with the supplemental agreement for the recognition of the Qalipu Mi'kmaq Band, dated July 4th, 2013.
Now we wait. Unfortunately, a ruling in the band's favor will not help my grandfather as he has now passed. There is no longer an opportunity for my grandfather to be compensated for the heritage he lost and the racism he suffered. If the court does not find that the law was broken by retroactively changing the assessment criteria for status, what are we left with?
So we're not carrying on the Mi'kmaq. They're cutting us out. I just want people to know that by having a status, our birthright taken from us, we do not qualify for Jordan's principle. And that's all you hear Trudeau talking about. My grandkids don't qualify for Jordan's principle because they don't have status.
Right.
They don't have status card. They can't be on a committee or anything. Can't be involved.
You can't be involved. Got it.
And it's not the money, Kim. It's our principle of what they're doing to us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Racism, genocide, everything. I need my status back.
Yeah.
My children need their status back.
Yeah.
We want our recognition of our birthright. I don't want anything else taken from me in my life. The only thing left to take is take me and bury me, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But I will fight till the end.
You keep on fighting, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't say it's over until it's over. We had it, we had the status, we had the benefits, and then it takes away from us.
We're left with all that we had before, everything that we are. I believe that it's something that I'm entitled to, but then I guess the court will decide on that.
And like I've said to people, never feel you can't drum. You beat your drum.
When I'm up close, looking at the situation through the eyes of my family, I see a legacy of hurt. This is one more time that Indigenous people are being told they are not enough. When I step back, I see a newly formed band that offers hope and will evolve with the growing Indigenous awakening in Newfoundland. And when I step back even further, I see an Earth whose ecosystems are dying. We've entered the 6th extinction event. We need to get to net carbon zero emissions by 2050 just to limit climate change to survivable levels. And yet, I see Indigenous groups all over the world finding their strength. It is my hope that Indigenous people will step into leadership roles everywhere, because we need your two-eyed way of viewing natural resources as more than commodities, as components of living systems. You may be wondering what my story is. Did I apply for status? Do I even qualify? Briefly, here's my story as told to my cousin Sylvia. So I had my mother, my grandmother, and my papa all idolizing this woman who raised 17 children, and it's wow, she was a legend to me. And then to find out that she was Mi'kmaq, and to find out that she had to start working at the age of 10 as a maid until I was 18 years old. I did not know that my papa was not my biological grandfather. And so when I found that out, obviously I was shocked. And of course it didn't change how I felt about my grandfather, because I was very close to my grandma and my papa. So I actually had conversations as a child, asking, Indian was the word that they used. Papa's Indian? Really? It's yeah. Oh, that's so cool. That means I'm Indian. And my mother goes, no, you're not. And I said to my grandmother, but if Papa is, then yeah, I am. And my grandmother looked at us and said, yes, of course you are. The application process itself was only open from 2008 to 2011, so even if you have a significant claim, if you didn't apply at that time, you are now not able to join as a founding member. Personally, I feel it would be inappropriate as someone who doesn't have Indigenous bloodlines to apply for Indigenous status, because it would distract and diminish, in my opinion, from the Indigenous awakening that's currently happening all over Canada. I'd like to thank my mother, Florence Whalen, my uncle, William Locke, son of my grandfather, William Locke, my uncle, Tony Locke, my aunt, Sandra Locke, my husband, Peter Bell, my daughter, Amanda, and a special thank you to Sylvia Murphy, Grandma Salmon, for their contributions to this podcast. It is a deep honor to me to be part of the Locke family and to have had the privilege to tell this story. I hope I did it justice. Thank you for listening.